What do you do when you're leading a routine patrol, 2 light tanks and a jeep, and you round a bend near a small German town to find 200 people standing by the side of the road, each one so thin with starvation that it takes you a moment to understand what you're actually looking at? What happens when those 200 people see your American uniform and start laughing, if you can even call it laughing, because it's really something closer to disbelief finally breaking loose after years of believing this moment would never come? And what do you do when you learn that behind them, in a rail siding in the woods, sit 45 freight cars holding 2,300 more people just like them? On the afternoon of April 13, 1945, Major Clarence Benjamin of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion found exactly that. We'll show you exactly what happened next in a moment. First, you need to understand where that train had actually come from and why it had stopped exactly where it did. This is the story of the Farsleben train. U.S. Army veterans and historians still call it the miracle at Farsleben. The threat on April 7, 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Germany from every direction. The SS ordered a transport train loaded with prisoners out of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, bound for their Seenstadt in Czechoslovakia. The train carried more than 2,500 Jewish prisoners, most of them survivors already weakened by months or years of imprisonment, many originally from Poland, Russia, and other parts of Eastern Europe, packed into 45 rail cars, the overwhelming majority of them open freight wagons never designed to carry human beings at all. Bergen-Belsen itself had, by the spring of 1945, become one of the most overcrowded and disease-ravaged camps still under German control, conditions that later liberating forces would document in some of the most harrowing photographic evidence to emerge from the entire Holocaust. The prisoners placed aboard the Farsleben-bound transport were, in that specific context, in some ways fortunate simply to have been selected for evacuation rather than left behind in a camp whose typhus epidemic and catastrophic overcrowding were, within weeks, about to claim thousands of additional lives before British forces liberated the camp itself in mid-April. That grim context, evacuation from one desperate situation into the uncertainty of an unplanned rail journey, frames the Farsleben rescue as one small, fortunate exception within a much larger and considerably darker pattern unfolding across the collapsing Reich during those same final weeks of the war. The train's intended journey never came close to completion. With Soviet forces advancing from the east and Allied bombing making rail movement across central Germany increasingly dangerous and unpredictable, the transport became stranded near the small town of Farsleben, close to Magdeburg, unable to continue in any direction. For days, the prisoners remained trapped aboard the halted train, conditions inside growing more desperate with each passing hour, food and water virtually non-existent, and the accumulated toll of exhaustion, illness, and starvation continuing to claim lives even as liberation, unknown to anyone aboard, was drawing closer by the hour. This particular transport was one of 3 such trains the SS dispatched from Bergen-Belsen in the war's final desperate days, part of a broader, chaotic pattern across the collapsing Reich, in which camp authorities attempted to evacuate or relocate prisoners ahead of advancing Allied and Soviet forces, often with little coherent planning and even less concern for the survival of the people being moved. Some historians studying this period have noted that these final evacuation transports, often called death marches or death trains, frequently proved more lethal than remaining in the camps themselves, since prisoners already weakened by years of imprisonment were forced into conditions offering even less food, shelter, and medical care than the camps they were being evacuated from. The Farsleben train's forced halt, whatever suffering it caused in the days before rescue, may well have spared its passengers from a considerably longer and more lethal journey had it continued toward its original destination. The secret development: there was no planned rescue operation that found the train at Farsleben. What there was instead was a routine reconnaissance patrol, a chance encounter, and a group of American soldiers who had to process, in real time, exactly what they were looking at. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon on April 13, 1945, Major Clarence Benjamin, leading a small task force from Dog Company built around 2 light tanks and his own jeep, was conducting what the unit's own history described as a routine patrol when the group came upon roughly 200 people standing along the side of a road near Farsleben. Wayne Robinson, chronicling the 743rd Tank Battalion's wartime service, described what Benjamin's men actually saw. Men and women, each one skeleton thin with starvation, carrying an unmistakable sickness in their faces and in the way they stood. At the sight of the American uniforms, the group began laughing, in whatever sense laughter could still apply to people in their condition, an eruption of disbelief and relief after an ordeal most of them had genuinely expected to end in death rather than rescue. The SS guards who had been overseeing the train, spotting the approaching American reconnaissance force, fled the scene almost immediately, abandoning their prisoners rather than risk capture themselves. Benjamin, working with prisoners who could speak enough English to explain the full situation, quickly understood that the 200 people gathered by the roadside represented only a fraction of what remained hidden in the wooded ravine behind them, where the full train, 45 cars carrying more than 2,300 additional prisoners, sat exactly where it had been abandoned. The speed of the SS Guards' flight reflects the broader collapse of German military and administrative authority across the region by mid-April 1945, with American forces advancing rapidly enough that Guard units overseeing even a heavily loaded prisoner transport judged their own personal survival more urgent than continuing to enforce control over the people in their custody. That abandonment, while it left the prisoners suddenly and genuinely free, also meant they were left with no food, no medical support, and no organized plan for their own care in the hours immediately following the Guards' departure, entirely dependent on whatever assistance the arriving American forces could improvise on short notice. The gap between the Guards fleeing and American aid actually arriving in sufficient quantity, even though it measured only hours rather than days, proved long enough that some of the weakest survivors did not live to see the full scale of the rescue effort that followed. Technical supremacy, there is no chapter in this story about a carefully prepared humanitarian operation, because the American soldiers who found the Farsleben train had no advance plan, no specialized supplies staged for exactly this scenario, and no training specifically designed for managing the sudden, overwhelming needs of 2,500 starving concentration camp survivors discovered in the middle of an active combat advance. What followed instead was rapid, improvised coordination across multiple American units, each contributing exactly what it could as word of the discovery spread up the chain of command. The 743rd Tank Battalion's own personnel, alongside soldiers from the 30th Infantry Division's 105th Medical Detachment and the 823rd Tank Destroyer Battalion, converged on the site over the following hours and days, working to address medical needs, arrange food and water for people whose digestive systems, after prolonged starvation, could not simply resume normal eating without serious risk, and begin the complicated logistics of sheltering and processing more than 2,500 survivors in a rural area never designed to support a population increase of that scale. Farsleben itself, a town with a normal population of roughly 500 people, suddenly found itself hosting 5 times that number in makeshift, urgent conditions. The human cost of the delay before rescue arrived remained visible even after American forces took control of the site. Official accounts documented that approximately 16 people died of starvation in the hours immediately surrounding the liberation itself, unable to be saved even after help had finally arrived. Deaths that occurred close enough to the moment of rescue to underscore exactly how narrow the margin between survival and loss had actually been for the people aboard that train. Feeding severely malnourished survivors safely presented its own genuine medical challenge that the arriving American units had to navigate with essentially no formal preparation for a crisis of this specific kind. Medical personnel who had trained primarily to treat combat wounds now faced patients whose digestive systems had been so compromised by prolonged starvation that sudden access to normal food portions could itself prove dangerous or even fatal. a condition modern medicine would later formally recognize and term refeeding syndrome. Soldiers on the ground, working largely on instinct and whatever guidance more experienced medical officers could offer in the moment, had to balance the urgent, visible need to provide food and water against the less obvious danger of doing so too quickly or in too great a quantity. A genuinely difficult judgment call made under pressure by men whose combat training had never specifically addressed a scenario like this one. The global impact among the roughly 2,300 survivors was a young doctor, George Gross, then a soldier with the 743rd Tank Battalion, who would spend much of the rest of his life connected to the story of that day, eventually working alongside historian Matthew Rozell decades later to help document and preserve the full account of the liberation. Gross died in 2009, but not before his own recollections, combined with Rozell's painstaking historical research, helped transform what had been for decades a largely unknown episode into one of the more thoroughly documented individual liberation stories of the entire war. That documentation effort produced something genuinely remarkable in the decades that followed. Matthew Rozell, a history teacher in upstate New York, began tracking down survivors of the Farsleben train starting in the early 2000s, eventually locating and helping to reunite more than 275 Holocaust survivors with the American soldiers who had liberated them. Connections that, in many cases, had never previously existed since the chaotic circumstances of the liberation itself had left little opportunity for survivors and their rescuers to exchange names or stay in contact. A photograph taken that day by Major Benjamin himself, capturing the raw emotion of the moment of liberation, has since become recognized as one of the most powerful and widely reproduced images associated with the liberation of Nazi concentration camp prisoners during the entire war. Rozell's project began almost by accident, growing out of a series of oral history interviews he conducted with local World War II veterans for a high school history class. Interviews originally intended simply to preserve first-hand combat accounts before the last surviving veterans of the war passed away. When former tank commander Carol Walsh mentioned the train almost as an afterthought during one such interview, Rozell recognized the significance of what he was hearing and began the painstaking process of researching the event further, eventually publishing accounts online that survivors and their descendants, searching for information about their own family histories decades later, began discovering and responding to. That accidental origin, a local oral history project stumbling onto one of the war's more significant and previously underdocumented liberation stories, illustrates how much of this history might otherwise have remained scattered and unconnected, had one persistent teacher not decided to follow a passing comment all the way to its full, remarkable conclusion. U.S. Army veterans connected to the 743rd Tank Battalion and the 30th Infantry Division carried the memory of Farsleben forward in different ways over the decades that followed, some speaking about it often, others, like Tank Commander Carol Walsh, barely mentioning it at all until decades later, when Rozell's research finally drew the story back out. Walsh, interviewed in 2001, spoke for 2 hours about battles, close calls, and friends lost, only mentioning the train almost as an afterthought when prompted by his own daughter, A detail that speaks volumes about how differently individual soldiers processed and carried the weight of what they had witnessed that April afternoon. The reunions that followed decades later, survivors meeting the elderly American soldiers who had once found them starving beside a stalled train in the German countryside, gave both groups something the original chaotic moment of liberation had never allowed: the chance to actually speak to one another, to say thank you, and to hear in return exactly what that afternoon had meant from the other side of the encounter. What began as a routine patrol that stumbled onto something no training manual could have prepared Major Benjamin's men for became, more than 60 years later, one of the most fully documented and personally reconnected liberation stories of the entire Second World War. A testament to what happens when a chance discovery is followed, decades afterward, by the patient work of making sure it is never allowed to be forgotten. Among the survivors Rozell eventually located and helped reconnect with their liberators was a child at the time of the rescue who had grown up to build an entire life in the decades since, one of many similar stories that emerged as the project expanded. These reunions, often documented on film and shared publicly, produced moments that neither the survivors nor the aging veterans had ever expected to experience. Elderly men who had carried a single afternoon's memory quietly for 60 years suddenly meeting, in person, the grown children and grandchildren of people whose lives their unit had helped save. For many of the participating veterans, these encounters provided a form of closure and meaning that decades of silence about their wartime service had never offered, transforming a fragment of memory that some had barely mentioned even to their own families into a living, ongoing connection that continued, generating new reunions and new documented accounts well into the 2010s and beyond.